Good evening, everyone. I am Brooke Clement. I am the director here at the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Library and Museum, which is part of the National Archives and Records Administration. I'm so glad to welcome you tonight. Thank you all for your continued commitment, and thank you as always to our terrific partners at the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation for bringing programs like this to us here in Grand Rapids. Before we continue, I'm just going to ask you to ensure that your cell phones are turned on silent or are off. And while you do that, I'm going to mention our upcoming programs and events for our very busy October. Next week on October 9th, we are hosting a film screening and a panel discussion regarding the American presidency. And on October 17th, Dr. Liette Gidlow of Wayne State will be exploring Grand Rapids League of Women Voters along with Betty Ford's involvement in the group. And then on October 22nd, Richard Norton-Smith and Hank Meyer will be here to discuss the Nixon pardon. Professor and author Scott Kaufman is going to be here on October 31st to discuss President Ford's legacy and his friendship with President Carter as we continue to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the Ford administration. And finally, this isn't in October, but we are going to be rounding out our 2024 programming with H.W. Brands on November 7th as he discusses the Ford presidency. And now I'd like to invite Jeff Paulette of the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation and Ross Douthat to the stage for a conversation on civil dialogue and democratic norms.
Good evening. Nice to see some familiar faces here and some new faces. Before I begin, I would like to thank our partners at the museum for hosting once again an event such as this. I'd also like to thank the Paul Henry Institute at Calvin. I can hardly bring myself to say university. I graduated from Calvin College, not university, but
bigger, better,
from our
faster,
bigger,
newer,
bigger, better. But our Micah Watson and our friends at the Henry Institute at Calvin University, we're very grateful to their support, and to Front Porch Republic for their support of tonight's event. I know you interned for, I should introduce our guests. Our guest tonight is well-known New York Times columnist Ross Douthat, who is also the author of 6 books, with the 7th book on the way called Believe, about religious faith in our contemporary age. But we're not going to talk about religion tonight. We are, alas, going to talk about politics. So, Ross, welcome back to Grand Rapids. Great to have you here again.
It's great to be back. I always enjoy my visits to the true capital of the United States of America.
Yeah, that's good. Butter up the audience right away. That's great. I know you interned for Bill Buckley, so I'm going to do a kind of Bill Buckley imitation here. Kind of like sit back and put the pen in my mouth.
That sounds good. I'll do a Gore Vidal imitation, and the night will really get fun.
How good would that be? If stock you in the mouth.
I think the trustees of the foundation might not appreciate it.
All right, well, let's begin. You've written recently that this election is a flight from ideology. What do you mean by that?
Well, so I guess what did I mean by that? That was like 7 columns ago.
Yeah,
That's totally unfair. So first of all, I just want to thank you for hosting me. Thank all of you for being here tonight. It is in fact lovely to be here. And hopefully this will be an interesting conversation. What did I mean by that? So the argument in that column, as I recall, which I'm sure I stand by 100%, was that basically the election of Donald Trump in 2016 and sort of the larger, what you might call the larger 2016 moment in American and Western politics, which I would say encompasses not just Trump himself, but also Bernie Sanders' surprisingly successful socialist campaign for the Democratic nomination, and of course the shock of Brexit in the UK, the sort of emergence of populism as a powerful force in Europe. All of that, I think, sort of shook loose political debates and created, especially for people in my profession, people who like to write about politics, this sort of sense of newfound possibility. We had, gone through a long period of a kind of ideological narrowing of debate in Western politics, where, there was assumption that communism had failed, socialism was naive, fascism was obviously very bad. And, out of that, you ended up sort of condensing all of political debate to the Mitt Romney versus Barack Obama election of 2012, possibly the most boring presidential contest of at least my adult lifetime. And so 2016 was sort of an opening. It was like, well, wait a minute, a real estate developer turned nationalist populist can get elected president of the United States. The public of a European country can reject the project of the European Union, can reject the sort of inevitably unfolding future. And on the political left, the rule of the Clintons over the Democratic Party can be challenged not just by Barack Obama, who ended up, being a fairly establishmentarian figure, picked Hillary Clinton, obviously, as his Secretary of State after defeating her for the nomination. But no, it can be challenged by, a socialist from Vermont, Bernie Sanders, right? Who knows what's possible? And so for a certain period of time after that, on both the right and left, I think there was a real attempt to sort of forge new ideological visions, right? On the left, that meant different forms of sort of socialist and social democratic ambition. It also meant the different forces that we call, or at least conservatives like me call wokeness, right? Sort of, progressive, anti-racist, feminist, sort of semi-utopian progressivism, right? Those became very powerful forces in American life in the Trump era in a way they hadn't been 10 years earlier. And then on the right, there were all these efforts to sort of, take Trumpism and link it to some grander ideological project. And everyone from, Nietzschean neo-pagans to Catholic integralists to supporters of industrial policy and tariffs, right? We're all sort of claiming Trump as their own. And it was all very, interesting, terrifying in certain ways, if you fear having crazy people close to power. But, I'm a journalist. I mean, it's not what we're afraid of. We're afraid of boredom, repetition, nothing to write about. So this was all very, I think, notable. There was a kind of return of ideology. And what I was saying in that column is that in this election, maybe not in all of American politics, but in this election, those sort of big sweeping new worldviews really aren't showing up. This is, I think, particularly true with the Harris campaign, which is very consciously tried to run away from all of the ideas that progressives got incredibly excited about in 2018, 2019, and 2020, and not to sort of substitute some other set of ideas, just to sort of, not clearly have any big ideas at all, right? Except obviously that Donald Trump is bad and Roe v. Wade should be restored and so on. It's not a, completely content-free campaign, but if you compare it to the world of, sort of a world where Democrats were competing to propose the most sweeping Medicare for all blueprint, the world of the racial reckoning of 2020, it's just a very, a much more constrained landscape for the Democrats. With Trump now, he still is running on a big tariff and, a sort of certain kinds of economic nationalism that hasn't gone away. And he still is obviously Donald Trump, and he has J.D. Vance as his running mate, and Vance is sort of associated with different populist currents. So you could say, okay, Harris is running away from left-wing ideas, but right-wing ideas are alive and well. in the Trump campaign, except that, you know, apart from the promise, the tariff promise, Trump is basically running a campaign of pandering to, you know, any constituency that asks him to pander to them, right? It's like, you want a tax cut, you can have a tax cut. Tax cuts for the rich, tax cuts for tipped workers, you know, we're gonna no taxes on Social Security benefits. There's no ideological coherence to this. He's desperately trying to run towards the sort of socially liberal flank on everything from abortion to marijuana. There's no hint of, you know, Catholic theocracy looming in this way that Donald Trump is
Despite the pages
campaigning.
of your newspaper to the contrary, but
I'm not responsible for all of the pages of my newspaper. As a national institution, we host a diverse range of views, and yes, that's all I have to say about that. But yeah, so I think that's an interesting feature of this election. It feels in certain ways like a very high stakes election, again, because Trump is Trump and because we've lived through this period of sort of escalating populist versus woke or populist versus socialist conflict. But in terms of how the candidates are presenting themselves, the policy stakes seem actually surprisingly low, right? You know, and you can even extend that to foreign policy. I mean, yes, you know, we know that Trump, if he's elected, is going to try and strike some kind of deal to end the war in Ukraine, whereas Harris is being very cagey about what she's going to do to end the war in Ukraine. But both candidates are formally committed to supporting Israel. There's no sort of huge foreign policy clash of visions beyond the particular issue of you know, what you might give up for peace in Ukraine, which again, it's not a small issue, but it's not the scale of conflict that seemed to be emerging just a few years ago, I would say.
So if 2012 was the most boring election of your lifetime, and
2000 also a little bit boring.
Well, at least it ended.
But the end of 2000 was exciting.
Yeah.
And I was mercifully paying slightly less attention to politics back then. Yeah. Whereas 2012, I started at the New York Times in 2009. So that was sort of the first few years. I was a very young newspaper columnist. I was supposed to be representing conservatism to the, you know, liberal-leaning readers of the Times. And it was just like a terrible time to be doing that. The debates were not issues that I had any experience writing about. And then, yes, you had to act as if the 2012 campaign was, you know,
the most important,
this very important, decisive choice. Yeah. And it was important in various ways that we didn't anticipate because it set the stage for what was to come.
So what happened between 2012 and 2016 that we go from a kind of staid, dull campaign to a highly chaotic campaign?
Yeah, it's a really good question.
I thought so.
And I wish I had a really good answer. I think a few things happen, right? So if in part, one thing that happens is just sort of the beginning of real technological change in American life. Like a lot of what we experience as sort of constitutive of, you know, this era in politics is a bit downstream from people spending way too much time on the internet. And that's something, you know, there's no sort of single point where that, you know, you can say, this is the beginning of the internet era. You know, you can look at the iPhone moment, you can look at the rise of social media, but certainly there's sort of an acceleration in the early 2010s in just how online politics is. So that has some effect. On the left, I think there's a clear sense of disappointment with what the Obama presidency represented. If you go back to 2008, definitely not the most boring election of my lifetime. There was this incredible investment, passionate investment in the idea of the first African-American president as this transformative figure in American political history. And there were a lot of liberals at that moment who looked at 2008 and said, you know, well, this is the moment when we finally defeated conservatism. You know, conservatism is going to go away, right? Books were written about the end of conservatism after 2008. And instead, you basically had very quickly the Tea Party movement emerged, Republicans came roaring back, and you ended up with sort of gridlock and stalemate. And even though Obama was reelected, by his second term, nothing was really happening in Washington, D.C. And so you had a lot of, especially younger progressives, I think, who felt like, okay, this didn't work. You know, the Republicans are still there. What's up with that?
Yeah.
Right? You know, we're not in a post-racial landscape. In fact, you know, racial gaps in American life are still here and they're not closing. And, you know, what can we do about that? Something more radical is needed. And so I think you just sort of had a kind of rolling discontent that gets picked up and embodied by certain intellectuals. My then colleague, or my former colleague at The Atlantic, Ta-Nehisi Coates, for instance, emerges as a kind of African-American left-wing critic of liberal piety, sort of criticizing Obama-era liberalism from the left, saying it's not doing enough about racial gaps in American life. We need, you know, fuller anti-racism. We need reparations for slavery. These kind of things, and that just sort of, I think, snowballs and leads to influences both what Bernie Sanders represented and what wokeness, social justice, whatever you want to call it, represents. And on the right, I think, again, this is just theorizing a little bit, but I think there was kind of a delayed reaction to the catastrophic ending of George W. Bush's presidency, right? Where, you know, Bush was, it's easy to forget this now, but Bush was, you know, for a brief window, incredibly popular president who American conservatives, especially in the post 9/11 moment, were just deeply invested in the idea that, you know, he was, you know, as great as Ronald Reagan. You know, the post 9/11 world was sort of the new Cold War, this new sort of organizing force for American conservatism. There was this, I think there was this tremendous investment in the Bush presidency that then in various ways, the Iraq War, the financial crisis, just came to real grief and ended with the election of Barack Obama. And I think it sort of took conservatism a little while to process that, right? You had sort of these different narratives of what had gone wrong. The Tea Party basically said, oh, the only thing that went wrong in the Bush presidency was that he spent too much money, which was obviously not true, right? But was sort of ideologically appealing. It was like, oh, we just need to get back to small government principles and everything will be fine. But that was insufficient. And I think, you know, Trump came along and basically tapped into this deeper discontent that didn't even know how to articulate itself. That was a discontent with, you know, the Bush presidency, a discontent with the general direction of American society. I mean, you know, you can, 1 million words and counting have been spilled on the Trump phenomenon. But if I was going to say why then, I would say, yeah, that's the period when the left started to express its disappointment with the failure of Barack Obama to usher in a post-racial utopia, and when the right sort of began to really process what had gone wrong in the Bush era and cast about for, you know, radical alternatives. And there was Donald Trump right there, ready.
Of all people.
You know, chosen by Almighty God for inscrutable purposes.
You mentioned populism a couple of times earlier, and not just in the US, but in Europe as well, we saw during that period. And you can see, in terms of a historical comparison, when populist movements tend to arise, and there are common themes. I'm going to draw attention to a couple of them and ask you to comment on it. But one of them is a perception of corruption among the elites. And if that's true, that populist movements arise when the elite become corrupt, what was the corruption that was being perceived that led to that kind of reaction? What was going on among the elites?
Well, I mean, I think what's distinctive about this populist moment is just like when you think about populism in the American past, it often will represent, some sort of regional economic interest that sometimes goes national, right? But, if you look back to the literal populists in the late 19th century, to William Jennings Bryan, or if you look forward in different ways to, like, the Dixiecrats and George Wallace represented a kind of very different kind of regional populism. It usually represents some sort of sense that, like, our region is getting treated unfairly by the powers that be, and needs some kind of some kind of greater representation, right, in the halls of power. And yes, as you say, that those elites are self-dealing and corrupt and so on. What's interesting about populism in the 21st century is that it's transnational. The same patterns are showing up in the United States, in France, in the UK, in Germany, and with variations. But there's this basic pattern where it's a form of class polarization that shows up everywhere, where it's this division between a kind of, self-consciously meritocratic upper class that draws people from all over the country, right, and takes them up into elite academic institutions and creates this very large, highly educated ruling class, effectively. And then people who feel completely left out of the kind of social and economic order that bifurcation creates. And that means that, the populist in a, down at the heels region of Ohio ends up having a lot in common with the populist in, York in northern England, with the populist in a fading industrial town in France, right? Globalization means that these patterns show up all over. So it's not just sort of one regional set of economic interests trying to make itself felt. It's everywhere you look in the Western world, this line, the meritocrats against the populists, shows up over and over again. And I think the key sort of tinder for populist rebellion, there is a sense of corruption, yes, but there's also just a sense of that elite failure, right, is the crucial thing. So yes, if you look at the financial crisis in 2008, right, the fact that the big banks were bailed out while, lots of homeowners got screwed, right, that would be an example of sort of the kind of perception of corruption, right, that drives some of this rebellion, right? So you go from Obama to Bernie Sanders on the left or from Obama to Occupy Wall Street, right, to Bernie Sanders, because of this perception that Obama betrayed the left by bailing out the banks. And similarly, the Tea Party and Trumpism participate in that. So that's there, and that matters. But I think the bigger thing is that meritocracy justifies itself by saying, we deserve to rule because we're smart, right? That's the whole thing. Who gets to rule? The smart people. Why do they deserve to rule? Because they know what they're doing, right? And, in 1999, when, America was, bestriding the world successfully, and, the internet era was beginning, and, everybody was somewhat optimistic about the future, the meritocracy seemed to be able to sort of justify itself, right? It's like Alan Greenspan, the meritocrat of the right, and Bill Clinton, the meritocrat of the left. Between the two of them, they're running things pretty well. So, okay, we'll let them do it, right? But then you get the Iraq War, the financial crisis, the broader shock to working class America delivered by the opening to China and globalization. You get sort of a cascade of events that really cast into doubt the capacities of the people running things, that they actually know what they're doing. And there are analogs in Europe with immigration, the euro. Basically, you have a big set of elite projects, right of center and left of center, that just start going really badly. And I think that's, in the end, that's more important than the corruption angle to understand where populism comes from. It's this sense that, you claim to rule because you're smart, and yet, you keep you keep messing everything up. So why should you be allowed to rule? That's I think the essence of the populist critique right now, I think.
In a book I'm sure you know, Christopher Lash's The Revolt of the Elites, which was written in '95, I believe.
Yep.
He says one of the key features of the meritocracy is their devaluing of manual labor. And it does seem that our economy is bifurcated that way, right? That the meritocracy is engaged in financial speculation, non-productive sorts of activities, whereas
Social media posting, newspaper opinion writing. Yep.
yeah, so,
Yep.
so
Soft hands on a keyboard.
yeah, but they're operating in the world of abstractions and symbols.
Yep.
Whereas people who engage in manual labor are engaged in the world of real things. Is that really the division in America right now between those who peddle in symbols and abstractions and those who work with real things?
I mean, I love Christopher Lash, and I think that is part of the division. I think, you don't want to go too far in flattering the populist side of the debate, though. I mean, that is a formula that's like, okay, you got your salt of the earth working man over here, right? And you've got your, slightly effete, overeducated, symbolic analysts, right? Like over there. That exists, yes. But there's more complexity to it than that, right? Like, the populists don't just live in the realm of physical reality. Everyone lives in the digital realm, right? Like that's part of the story of our era too. So populism itself is not, I mean, this is one of the many weaknesses of populism, right? Is that maybe especially right-wing populism, this is true of left-wing populism too. It's not like a movement, it's a movement that also exists virtually, like in sort of a primary and powerful way, right? So many of the focuses and fascinations of Donald Trump supporters are not material interests, right? They're, very online causes and issues and so on, right? And like the whole idea that is obviously really important to populism of owning the libs, right? Of like, triggering your obnoxious, overeducated enemies. Like that's not a material crusade, right? I mean, and it's not sort of a working man's rebellion. It is it is itself a participation in the digital, the virtual, the kind of unreal landscape that Lash is critiquing. So that's sort of partially how I would qualify that, right? And there also is a way in which, like, this maybe fits with Lash's narrative, right? But like there is also a divide. The populist side of this split includes many people who have a lot of money, right? And I mean, one of the general features of American life in the early 21st century is that we're an extremely rich country in which even, the hardworking salt of the earth plumber is not, he's not a poverty-stricken peon ground down under the heel of the New York Times, right? He's got a big truck. He's got a big house. He's doing pretty well, right? A manager at Sheetz in Alabama makes, is richer than like a duke in America is wealthy. It's very wealthy, sort of up and down the ladder, right? And so again, you get like, a big division in terms of, who supports Donald Trump versus who supports Kamala Harris. It's not even how much money you have. It's just, how you made it, right? And if you made money by participating in the particular ladder of success that the meritocracy sets up, then you were going to vote for liberals, and not always, but like as a generalization. And, if you made money by, inheriting the chain of gas stations that your father owns and buying 5 more because you're a savvy businessman, you're going to be voting for Donald Trump again, to generalize, right? And I think in Lashian terms, you could say, okay, the guy who owns 20 gas stations is more in touch with the world than the financial analyst. Yes, but he's not like a character from an 1890s union like movement, right? Like the gas station entrepreneur is himself a well-off American who does have real power in the world. The Lashian frame is useful, but if you're coming from the conservative side, it's good to qualify the extent to which you romanticize the populists. I don't know.
There's a line of thinking that argues that it's during periods where you have greater material well-being that you're going to get greater social conflict. I mean, Tocqueville makes this argument. Lash makes the argument as well, and that it's this kind of obsession with material well-being where you have, Tocqueville has a line where he says, you're expecting the government to satisfy unlimited desires with limited means. So if we enter a period of greater scarcity, I mean, you seem to be suggesting that we're all much better off than we think we are, and we would expect that to lower the heat a little bit, but it doesn't seem to be doing that. And then I wonder, so if we start introducing genuine economic scarcity into our politics, given debt crises that we have and so forth, what does our politics look like on the other side of that? If it's conflictual now, or do you think that we're not going to enter a period of economic scarcity?
I don't really think we're going to enter a period of economic scarcity, which, anytime you say that, you're making yourself a hostage to tomorrow's stock market.
That was part of my master plan for you.
Yeah. I think we've been in a period, we've spent some time in periods of relative economic stagnation, where the country is rich, but not getting richer at the pace that people came to expect. And we have just had a bout of inflation, which we haven't had since the era of, the man in whose name we are all here. We have, those, I think both of those kind of things may recur. You'll have sort of stagnation and you'll have inflation as we sort of try and figure out how to work our way through the challenge of an aging population and a large national debt. I'm pretty skeptical of scenarios in which the United States of America faces sustained economic decline in the next 25 to 50 years. There are places in the world that I expect to experience that kind of decline, mostly for reasons related to depopulation and the collapsing birth rate. But I don't think America is going to be one of them. So yeah, I'm a little skeptical of the premise. It is a good question, though, if there was some kind of severe shock, how American society would react. I think one way to understand our sort of, derangements and polarization, right, is a kind of variation on that Tocquevillian idea, right? So it's not so much that as society gets richer, people's material expectations get, too high and they demand too much from the government. It's more maybe that as people's material well-being increases, they become more focused on status. And so they look to politics not to supply material interests, but to raise and lower the status of their group versus other groups. I think there's a lot of that in the meritocrats versus populists thing that I'm describing on both sides, right? Like the language of deplorables, right? This sort of desire that a certain kind of liberal critic of Donald Trump has to just like banish Trump supporters. It's not that they want to tax Trump supporters to death or take their resources or, drive, I don't know, like invade rural Kentucky and, take the land of everyone who voted for Trump and, whatever, put them in FEMA camps or something. That's not probably the right reference to make right now. But it's not that. It's the impulse is people who supported Trump should have their status lowered in society in some profound way. And then on the populist side, clearly there's this desire to like, we are going to stick it to you guys. You guys think you're better than us, but guess what? You don't get to tell us what to say and think. You don't get to lower our status and so on. So I think there's a lot of that. And that fits in really well with the migration of politics into this virtual landscape, right? So America is super polarized on the internet, right? Super polarized on cable news. If you drive around America, it does not actually seem like a country, right, that's on the verge of collapsing into civil war. If you go online, it does feel that way, right? And, throughout the Trump presidency, I would make this point and people would say, well, okay, but if a crisis comes along, that could change. And in fact, they were partially right. COVID came along, we got a year of crisis, and we got riots, we got a crime wave, we got January 6th, we got more actual public conflict than we'd had for a while. But then the pandemic went away, and so did that level of public conflict. So I guess that proves that with the right shock, you could take this virtual status-oriented conflict and turn it into something a little more real, a little more, destructive and deadly. And maybe that could happen if there was a big economic shock.
I just want to,
Yeah.
you don't think a $37 trillion debt or unfunded liabilities in the hundreds of trillions you don't think that's a problem?
I didn't say it's not a problem.
You don't think it's going to bring a shock to the system at some point?
I mean, I think it will lead to a mixture of periodic bouts of inflation, like what we've just had, which is a shock of a sort, certainly, but different from like Argentinian economic collapse. I think America will be the last country on earth to experience that, which is not to say it couldn't happen. But when I look at the future, I mean, if you look at, there's no country you'd rather be than the United States, right? What you're seeing around the world, this is sort of a weird take on the future, but I think it's correct. So the fundamental fact, this is like everyone has their monomania, right? And mine is collapsing global birth rates, sorry. But if you look around the world, the fundamental story of the next 40 or 50 years is that there are all of these countries that are getting old before they have fully gotten rich. Most notably, our leading geopolitical rival, the People's Republic of China. And when I say they're growing old, 10 or 15 years ago, that meant, a sort of gradual shift in the population with more retirees and fewer workers, but gradual, not like, slowly moving in a Floridian direction, let's say, with a lot more retirees. But something has changed in the last 5 or 10 years, some combination of the effect of, again, the internet, the effect of COVID, maybe. It's a lot of, I'm not sure what the theory is, but something has hit the accelerator on these trends. So you have all of these countries from, that are from European countries to East Asian countries, South Korea, Thailand, Latin America, that are headed to birth rates around like, 1.2, which means just to not bore you too much, but means for every 2 people in the next generation, there are 1.1, 1.2 people. In South Korea, it's 0.7. That means that if current trends continue, the population of South Korea will shrink by potentially 2/3 over the next 60 years. That's actually kind of an insane proposition. And I think people have not fully thought through what this means. People have thought, well, we had 30 million people before, now we have 60 million people. In the future, the population will shrink. We'll have 30 million people again. That's fine. It's, what's the big deal? But a country of 30 million people that has a big and growing young population is just totally different from a country of 30 million people that has a tiny young population and the infrastructure for a much larger population. You get ghost towns, you get huge abandoned apartment buildings, you get literally wolves roaming the streets, as you already have in some depopulated areas of Europe. And in this landscape, in a lot of those places, one, growth slows down inevitably. Two, people leave. So people are leaving Bulgaria. People are leaving big parts of Latin America. And the people who are leaving are the younger and more talented people, because you don't want to be the last young person in a country that doesn't have any young people anymore. So this is bad news for the world. It's just bad news. It's not clear to me that it's bad news for the United States of America. The United States of America, over the last 5 or 10 years, has started to pull away in terms of economic growth, technological dynamism, innovation from our main peer competitors in Western Europe. It doesn't seem like China is going to leapfrog past us the way a lot of people thought 10 or 20 years ago. And the US, for all that we also have a birth rate problem, we also have a lot of cultural resources that are useful for encouraging dynamism and growth. We have the vastness of American suburbia, which is, believe it or not, an extremely important resource. We have more religious piety, religious practice than a lot of wealthy countries around the world. We generally have more optimism and hope for the future and patriotism and a million other things, all of which are under threat in various ways. And, it's all—
And declining.
Well, declining, I believe, I'm going to be really optimistic. I think the decline of organized religion has stopped over the last 5 years.
But the decline in patriotism is precipitous among younger generations.
Yeah, the decline in patriotism. Well, we're going to need a rebound in patriotism. We're going to need— I'm not super optimistic about the next 20 years of American life. I think we're going through a rough time. But if you go ahead 20 or 30 years, like, there isn't going to be any other place to be. The most talented people in the world are all just going to want to come to the United States because we're going to be the last place that is growing and dynamic and optimistic. This means the immigration debate is never going away.
Yeah.
Even though global population is falling, that population decline will still yield more and more immigration. So get used to immigration politics. That's not going anywhere. But yeah, I think that America is going to find a way to float its trillions of debt not without problems, but without collapse. Because in fact, we're going to be the only game in town. God bless America.
So you're basically saying we're the Forrest Gump of the world. We're in the storm right now. We don't have to be the best shrimp boat. We just have to be the last shrimp boat that's out on the water.
I mean, well, no, but it's not even because it's not even that. We do things right to some degree in terms of, one of the reasons that conservatism in particular is such a mess right now is that modern conservatism, the conservative movement going back to the 1950s, right? Its whole thing was, we're defending American exceptionalism, right? We're defending the things that make America unique among other developed countries, which means, limited government, Tocquevillian community and solidarity, strong religious and patriotic spirit, and, capitalist dynamism, right? And conservatism has this identity crisis because a lot of those things have gotten weaker. America's less religious. We've been less dynamic in various ways. Our government is bigger, our communities are weaker. There's a ton of problems. But when you compare us, again, to Britain, South Korea, these are the rich countries in the world. I'm not even getting to like the condition of, Argentina or Chile or, Thailand or something. When you compare us to just our peer competitors, we still have more dynamism, more religion, more patriotism, more of a lot of the things that give energy and vitality to a society. So it's less Forrest Gump. It's more in the kingdom of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. I think that's more it. We've still got one eye. We're really working with our metaphors here. We've still got one eye, and it's red, white, and blue. In a good way.
All right. Well, with that, I'm going to invite the audience to ask some questions. And since there are Front Porch Republic people here, I expect somebody to ask you about your view of suburbia.
Yes, I know that's
is,
a hostile. I know it's,
yeah,
James Howard Kunstler will emerge from behind the curtain.
You poked the bear on that one. Yeah. I remind you, please ask a question, wait for the microphone, and please be to the point. Right here.
Going back to early on, you seem to suggest a lack of concern about who is elected in this forthcoming election. And I was just wondering how...
I don't want to suggest a lack of concern.
Oh, hold on. I just wonder how you fit that in with the SCOTUS decision on presidential immunity and on Project 2025.
Well, Project 2025 is fake, not in the sense that there are not people working for the Heritage Foundation who, did not come up with a long list of potential policy proposals. That does, in fact, exist. But the idea that, this is the blueprint that Donald Trump as president is going to, using all of his administrative acumen, brilliantly implement, thereby transforming American government forever, was, even before Trump started going around denouncing it, which he does regularly, was just never realistically going to happen. And if you actually dig into not the MSNBC version of Project 2025, but like if you actually sat down and read whatever all 2,500 pages of stuff that's in there, which I don't recommend. I mean, it is, I'm a conservative. There are a bunch of conservative ideas in there I agree with. There's some ideas I don't agree with. There's some kooky stuff, but mostly it's just not that different from the stuff that conservative think tanks have been putting out since Ronald Reagan was elected president. It's sort of reshaped for the populist era and so on, but it's, it's not that different from what, like, Paul Ryan, had he been given absolute power, would have implemented or something. If you're a liberal, it's going to have a lot of things you disagree with, but it's not like a blueprint for theocracy, fascist dictatorship, and so on. It's just a bunch of right-wing ideas that probably are not actually going to go anywhere, not least because, as I suggested, I think this is true, Donald Trump himself doesn't really care that much about, cares about his own power, doesn't care that much about right-wing ideas. So if you're worried about like scenarios for a second Trump term, I think it's perfectly reasonable to worry about Trump going in and saying to his DOJ, come up with some kind of BS case to, charge Nancy Pelosi with corruption or something. I think that's a totally legitimate thing to worry about. I do also think that, the courts in the United States would smack down. I mean, the presidential immunity ruling makes it easier for a president like Trump to pressure his own DOJ to, sort of come up with bogus prosecutions without himself worrying about subsequent prosecutions. It doesn't make it easier for that DOJ to then actually convict anybody. And if Trump does a bunch of, sort of forces them to pursue a bunch of bogus prosecutions, it will be bad, but they will mostly be thrown out, including by Trump-appointed judges. Again, I'm not saying this is good, but that's like, I think that's the level of, that's a more reasonable level of worry than Donald Trump has a blueprint from the bowels of the Heritage Foundation to turn the United States into, a sort of right-wing authoritarian state. I don't think He doesn't have such a blueprint. The project itself is not such a blueprint. It has a lot of ideas you would totally disagree with, but most of those ideas are not going to be implemented. And I wouldn't worry that much about that. There's plenty to worry about with Trump, but it's more in the realm of personal instability, corruption, and incompetence, I think, than it is like he's going to affect some broad ideological transformation of America. I think, you know, I may be wrong, but that's what I would say.
Russell.
Is this on?
It
I
is.
guess it is. I was fascinated by your criticism. Well, it wasn't really a criticism. It was more like a qualification of the Lashian framing of us talking about populism, and it strikes me that it's a very insightful qualification, because while Lash is obviously talking about more than, you know, the salt of the earth fighting back against you know, the oppressive tech masters, it is important to recognize that to the extent that we think about things that way, most of this fight is taking place online. Most of it is taking place amongst people on both the left and the right that are very comfortable using digital tools and have the financial resources to have available to them a whole bunch of digital tools. As you were laying out, you know, this struggle as you see it and its lack of applicability to that kind of more extreme Lashian formation, I thought of another Democratic socialist not named Bernie Sanders, Barbara Ehrenreich. In The Fear of Falling, she frames all sorts of political debates basically in terms of credentialed middle class, upper middle class people desperately fearing a loss of status. And that's how she looked at a lot of the conflicts taking place in American life. I don't remember Fear of Falling well enough to remember if she explicitly tied that to like a populist formulation, but I wonder if there might be some parallels there. And I mean, what do you think about that way of thinking about it? That the populist movement in the United States and also in Europe, to a certain degree, is, you know, middle class, upper middle class people, business owners, you know, people that have achieved positions within their organizations that are seeing their status threatened by changes within the hierarchy, by changes within the culture. And that's what's, you know, the real engine here.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely something to that. And in saying that it's about status, sorry. It's definitely not an either or to say, oh, it's status or it's economics, right? These two things can obviously be linked, and you can feel your status as a thing that protects your economic position. You can feel your economic position as a thing that protects your status. And there's clearly a way in which, you know, different trends, the rise of the tech companies, financialization of the American economy, the decline of industry, and so on, raised and lowered both the relative economic power and the relative status of different groups that themselves remain prosperous, right? But like the prosperity of a business owner in Tulsa, Oklahoma, looks different in the, you know, digital age and than it does in 1957 or 1967 and so on. I don't know though, like I'm part of the PMC, right? The professional managerial class. And there's absolutely no question that the professional managerial class, which is mostly liberal, is consumed with anxiety about its own position and about competition, fear of falling, all of these things. That's absolutely the case. I don't fully know how that shapes its politics, right? Like being sort of, you know, I mean, there's a kind of left-wing theory that says, well, as the Democratic Party becomes more dominated by the upper middle class, it will cease to be left-wing on economics. But that hasn't completely happened, right? The Democrats still support universal health care. I mean, they're not, they're not where Bernie Sanders is, right? But they're still the more left-leaning party. They're still more likely to support higher taxes and greater social spending, right? One of my theories for a while was that parts of wokeness and social justice ideology reflected a kind of upper middle class liberal exhaustion with competition, that it was like easy to say, oh, the SAT is bad and racist, right? Because you yourself were tired of preparing your kids to take the SAT, right? Like all of those, there was this woman, Tima Okun, herself white, of course, who had this like, these presentations that then, were sort of taken up by all of these liberal organizations that were all about like, white supremacy culture, and how white supremacy culture meant an obsession with the written word and an obsession with like getting to work on time. And it's kind of crazy stuff, right? That like was taken up by a lot of institutions for a while. And I was sort of like, oh, well, maybe these institutions, they're so sick of meritocratic competition that they like the idea to say, oh, competition, that's just white supremacy culture. We're not going to do that anymore, right? Like, but that was sort of a columnist speculation. I'm not sure I actually believe it, but it was sort of like an attempt to figure out, well, yeah, how does all this, like just the incredible anxiety of the college admissions process, right? This is like a defining feature of life in the professional, mass upper class, whatever you want to call it. How does that cash out in politics? I don't completely know. Student debt forgiveness, maybe, but I don't know. It's a very, I don't know the answer, I guess. There's some link there, but it's not a simple one. Like all the socialists, in a way, the Bernie Sanders, the initial young socialists were like, Brooklynites who were sort of part of the upper middle class, but like precariously attached to it. And so you could see their socialism as a kind of expression of their own anxiety about falling beneath their parents' position, maybe. But this is very speculative. I don't know. It's certainly not a clear thing where you can say, these are the professional class's class interests. Here's how they're expressed through Kamala Harris. These are, the blue-collar Midwesterners' class interests. Here's how they're expressed through Donald Trump. It's much murkier than that.
Hello.
Go ahead.
Go for it. Go for it.
Nope, go ahead.
My name is Madeline Austin. Thank you for this conversation tonight. And I'd like to know if you could have every American read one book, what would it be and why?
Would it be one of yours?
Christopher Lash's Revolt of
No,
Revolt of the
no.
Elites. Every American read one book. I mean, I mean, I'm a Roman Catholic Christian, so I think the answer has to be the Gospel according to St. Matthew, right? Like I'm failing God himself if I don't give that answer. That's one answer, but maybe more in the spirit of your question. I mean, I think, I think it would be good for, I mean, I want to say something that is like fiction or literature. Like, I just don't think there's sort of a public policy book that like, oh, every American will read this, and then, then they'll figure out that I'm right about everything, and they should put me in charge.
But
I think
the question does raise,
I'm evading the question though, but
yeah,
go
no,
on,
and I'm
yes,
going to help you
yeah.
out here. It does raise an interesting problem, and that is, if you read Lincoln's speeches, he could draw upon a common cultural heritage that he knew everybody would resonate with everybody, the King James Bible, Shakespeare, and so forth,
Right.
because there was this shared cultural markers, right, texts. we just don't have anything like that today, where even if we had a rhetorician of Lincoln's skill, that he could draw upon a kind of common text that Americans share and have that resonate within our politics.
Yes, no, I think that's right, but that's why I was trying to think of something that would sort of fall into that. I mean, I think it might be good
Finding
to
Nemo,
read.
maybe.
I think I'm going to cheat. I'm going to cheat and say 2 books. I'm going to say Joan Didion's Slouching Towards Bethlehem and Tom Wolfe's Bonfire of the Vanities, which are respectively nonfiction essays and a very fun, mildly politically incorrect novel. But what's particularly useful about them is they're connected to the present. They, if you say go back and read, Longfellow or something from the 19th century, like that, there's just a real distance now for the reasons that you described. So I think it's better to just ask Americans to go back about 50 years. So you're still in a sort of recognizably modern period, but you're before pre-internet, even just pre the kind of political sorting we have today. Didion was started out as a sort of conservative and migrated leftward over time, and Wolfe was sort of idiosyncratically right wing. But just like the observation of like the sort of the older, weirder America, that the pre-virtual America, let me put it that way. They are both powerful observations on pre-virtual America. And I think our goal is to reach a kind of post-virtual America somewhere around 2075 or so.
Hi, it's Patrick Anderson. Question for you. Given your concern about lower birth rate, which I appreciate you putting on the public stage, what do you think about J.D. Vance's years-old statement about the childless cat ladies and the furious reaction to it and his semi-denial of it?
Yeah, I mean, the childless cat ladies comment was just sort of dumb. Like, I mean, America is not actually run by childless cat ladies. There was, and some of them, as Donald Trump would say, are good people, right? I think what Vance, well, I should say, I mean, I know what JD, since I know him. I think what he was trying to do in some of those now infamous podcast appearances was basically try and, he was talking to conservatives right then. He was trying to sort of build up his political career, but also trying to sort of participate in some of these intra-conservative debates that I was talking about that sort of happened after Trump was elected. And I think, one of the problems with life in a polarized country is that the only way you can really get people to care about an issue is if it's a culture war issue. If it's like, this is something we do that's good and the other side doesn't want it, right? And I think he was trying to sort of inject the declining birth rate discussion kind of in that way to sort of get conservatives to rally around the idea that, like, yeah, the liberals are hostile to large families and having kids, and we're for having families and large kids. So let's be on the side of, did I just say large kids? Yes, I did. I apologize to my own children who are very svelte. Large families and kids. And yeah, I think he was sort of experimenting with different ways to, to sort of talk about an issue politically that isn't talked about politically at all, and that most people find, to quote Tim Walz, very weird to talk about, right? When you stand up on the stage and talk about birth rates as a serious issue of public policy, Americans are like, well, first of all, most of them think the world is overpopulated, which is not the case. But also, it's like, what does the government have to do with my choice of how many kids I have? Like, this is not a political issue, right? So, I think Vance, some of the things he said that he got in trouble for, I would absolutely defend. Like, there was a whole thing where he talked about the idea that parents should be able to vote on behalf of their minor children, right? That if you have, a couple of kids, you should get to cast ballots on their behalf as well as their own. This was also flagged as an example of creepy, weird, whatever. And I will defend that idea happily for hours if you like. You probably don't want that. But yeah, so there were things he said in this attempt to sort of politicize the issue that I think were smart and good and interesting. And then there were things he said that were, not. And I think the childless cat ladies was not. I don't know. There's more to say, but that's an answer.
Yeah, please make sure it's on so the people online.
I can hear you. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Okay.
There
Yep.
we go.
Yep.
All right. You talked about how this election is not much about ideology, but obviously people are also talking a lot about realignments of ideologies. And I was curious what you thought of the RFK Jr. pivot of the kind of crunchy left to the right.
Yes.
Because I'm still trying to figure it out myself. If I squint really, really hard, I need a new prescription. I see a bit of George Kennan and Stu Udall mixed up with some other weird things in RFK Jr. But I'm still trying to figure out. So I'm curious
don't
about
think
what you think.
I don't think you can make it. This is, I guess, yeah, this can circle us back to the first point. I don't think you can make it make sense in ideological terms. Like Donald Trump is a man who has never exercised, never works out, boasts about, his terrible diet, and whose administration had absolutely zero interest in like promoting wholesome, crunchy living or whatever else, right? So how is he allied with Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who claims they're going to make America healthy again, right? Wasn't it just a few years ago that conservatives hated Michelle Obama, right, for wanting to make America healthy again? And the answer is that what aligns Trump and RFK is that they are both in different ways opposed to the meritocratic establishment. And Trump is opposed to the meritocratic establishment because he disagrees with it about free trade and immigration and, what his sort of economic nationalism and his whether we should be in NATO, maybe, like his list of issues. And RFK Jr. is opposed to the establishment because he disagrees with it about, vaccines, alternative medicine, diet, that sort of crunchy left list. And, there may be some alchemy from their alliance so that the heirs of Trump and RFK have some sort of fusion where it's like you eat a cheeseburger in the morning, and you use one of, you have turmeric tea and do yoga in the afternoon. I don't know, I don't know what, like, out of the alliances, you will get ideological ferment, but you can't look at them and say, what is the idea they hold in common? The idea they hold in common is that the experts are wrong.
About everything.
About everything, right? It's like if you watch 20 episodes of Tucker Carlson's current show and you try and come up with a coherent worldview out of the people he has on, you're not going to get one. But if you say, what do all these people have in common? Well, they all think that some aspect of the elite expert consensus is wrong. And one guy thinks the consensus is wrong because Churchill was actually, more responsible for World War II than people say. And one guy thinks the expert consensus is wrong because actually the US government is covering up a UFO retrieval program. Which might be, that's that's it. That's what they have in common. That Harvard, Yale, and New York Times, press and company accepted, are wrong, and some other perspective is right. And that's what holds the populist coalition together. And that's why you can have high stakes in an election. To go back to your question, I don't think the stakes in this election are low. I just don't think you can look at the election and say, okay, if Trump wins, this is the worldview that's won, right? Or if Harris wins, this is the worldview that's won. No, it's a conflict between, it's a conflict over who has the power to sort of set the parameters of reasonability and reasonable debate more than it is a clash between the socialist and the conservative or whatever else, which makes for very weird politics. It is very weird that all these people who were on the left are now on the right. But to predict who will make that move, it's all about their relationship to established authority, not the specific ideological details of their worldview.
Gleaves, we're going to turn it over to you to say some parting words.
Okay, let's have a round of
Thank you.
I really enjoyed that. I think a couple of characteristics about this conversation between Ross and Jeff is I thought there was an unpredictability in the answers, right? Were you all not delighted by how unpredictable the exchange
Unpredictable.
was? I mean, it's not a cookie cutter kind of presentation. So I appreciate that in both of you. The second thing that I really appreciated was a willingness, an intellectual openness to say, quite frankly, that you didn't have the final answer. You're continuing to explore. So you weren't acting like an expert. And I think everybody was delighted by that part of it.
That's right.
And maybe that's the wonderful thing. I'm married to a journalist, and so I understand, there are a lot of things. You need more evidence, and you need reasonable. The last thing you said about who sets the terms of reasonable debate and conversation. So I thought that was really, really terrific. One thing you said that I think was very intriguing, I will generalize just a little bit more, but you identified personal instability, corruption, and incompetence as characteristic of maybe some people in the current political scene. What I want to say, ladies and gentlemen, is that if you want the opposite of instability, and what's this?
Right there.
Yes,
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 yes.
you know exactly
Yes,
where I'm
no, I
going.
do.
Exactly. If you
Bring him
want the
back.
opposite, if you want
Right.
groundedness in reality, if you want squeaky clean integrity, if you want competence, you can't do any better than that guy right there on that wall, right? That's what we're about here at the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation.
There we go. Right.
I want to see a column about that in the New York Times. Now, this has been a wonderful evening. I've enjoyed it so much. And of course, evenings like this don't just happen. They happen because of great people here. We're so proud to have a member of the Ford family. Bob, thanks for coming to so many of our presentations here. Bob Ford there in the second row. It's also due to our wonderful hosts, our wonderful partners. Brooke, you run such a great ship here at the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Museum and then the library too in Ann Arbor. Thank you so much. And then for this particular program, I think Jeff did a masterful job pulling together a coalition of wonderful partners, Front Porch Republic, the Henry Institute at Calvin University, and of course, the Library and Museum and the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation that we represent. So for all these reasons, and then many more, and I'm looking at the many more right out here at the auditorium, all of you who are friends of Ford, thank you for your support. If you like events like tonight's that'll challenge you, bring sanity to the debates, and will continue to bring an optimism. I love that. You were more optimistic than I realized,
I've
actually.
switched. I've become more optimistic.
Okay.
Of a guy who wrote a book about decadence.
I mean,
The decadence, yeah.
But you're optimistic because you came to West Michigan. You're in Grand Rapids.
that's right. I said I breathed the clean air.
Yes, that's
Yeah.
right. But if you're hungering for more of this, become a friend of Ford. We want you. We need you. Tell your neighbors about what we're doing here. Come to this marvelous museum, tour it, and get the vibe up there of the virtue, the competence, and the groundedness that you have here at the Gerald R. Ford. Thank you so much.
Hey, Gleaves, just
Yeah,
one
yep.
last thing. Tomorrow at Calvin University, we are going to be having the Front Porch Republic Conference from 9 to 4. Ross is going to be the keynote speaker at the conference. We also have some other great speakers on our panels. So if you're interested, starting at 9 o'clock tomorrow at Calvin University, co-sponsored by the Ford Foundation and the Henry Institute and Front Porch Republic.
Thank you, William F. Buckley Jr. and Gore Vidal.
Here, here.
Good job.